This explainer. If you love connecting the dots across history, you are in exactly the right place. Today, we're not just looking at a bunch of isolated historical events. No, we're going to trace a massive, undeniable domino effect. We're exploring what I like to call a cascade of convergence, a crazy 300-year period that fundamentally remade the world we live in. So I want to start by asking you a question. How exactly did a single 15th century maritime voyage literally cool the Earth's atmosphere, and then somehow, inadvertently, lay the groundwork for a political revolution centuries later? Right? It sounds almost like a puzzle, or maybe a piece of fiction, but as we follow the evidence today, the connections are just absolutely astonishing. Okay, let's dive into this. Our journey through this 300-year cascade is broken down into 5 distinct eras. We'll hit first contact and conquest, then move into the Great Dying, examine competing northern empires, look at indigenous resistance and adaptation, and finally arrive at sparks of the revolution.
Era number 1, First Contact and Conquest.
To understand how this whole cascade begins, we really have to immerse ourselves in the late 15th century. For a very long time, Europe enjoyed overland trade routes to Asia, the famous Silk Road. But when Constantinople fell to the Ottoman Empire in 1453, those traditional safe land routes were suddenly compromised. This massive geopolitical shift forced European powers, especially a newly unified Spain, to scramble for alternative, ocean-based paths to all that Asian wealth and spices. And man, when Christopher Columbus sails west in 1492, operating under a massive underestimation of the Earth's size, by the way, the timeline moves incredibly fast. In 1492, he lands in the Bahamas, encountering the indigenous Taino people. By 1493, he's already returning to Spain with captured Tainos to present to the Spanish monarchs. Then, less than 40 years later, in 1532, Francisco Pizarro pushes deep into the Andes and ambushes the Inca ruler Atahualpa. Francisco Serres, who was actually there, detailed the incredibly tense moments right before Pizarro's ambush at Cajamarca. And this brilliantly illustrates what we're talking about here. The Spanish were vastly outnumbered, but they leveraged superior weaponry, horses, steel, artillery, against an empire that had literally never seen such things. It was a calculated, violent seizure of power that demonstrated the extreme military asymmetry between the two sides. Honestly, it's a sobering, horrifying reality of how rapidly these initial encounters turned into a complete restructuring of power. But the violence of men was really just the beginning. That brings us to era number 2, the Great Dying. 54 million. Just think about that number for a second. Over the 100 years following European arrival, the indigenous population of the Americas dropped from roughly 60 million down to just 6 million people. That is a 90% population drop. And the primary culprit wasn't just warfare. It was a total lack of immunity to introduce diseases like smallpox, measles, and influenza. Entire civilizations were just hollowed out. It was a demographic collapse of a scale that's almost unimaginable today, fundamentally changing the fabric of the continents forever. And this is where the story takes a tragic, but frankly mind-blowing leap into planetary science. As those indigenous populations plummeted, vast tracts of carefully managed agricultural land were suddenly abandoned. Without human management, natural vegetation and dense forests rapidly grew back across an area roughly the size of France. This massive terrestrial carbon uptake literally pulled carbon dioxide right out of the atmosphere, dropping CO2 levels globally by 7 to 10 parts per million. It is genuinely astounding to realize that this genocide-generated drop in carbon was significant enough to actually contribute to a cooling of the Earth, dipping global temperatures into what is known as the Little Ice Age in the 16th century. Human tragedy completely, undeniably altered the Earth's climate.
All right, Chapter 3, Competing Northern Empires.
While the Spanish were establishing their presence down south, the narrative shifts north. About a century later, other European powers, namely the British and the French, arrive in North America, scrambling for their own wealth and territorial dominance. But they brought vastly different imperial systems with them. The British model was heavily driven by permanent settlements and the cultivation of space-intensive cash crops like tobacco. Naturally, that system inherently required taking more and more land, which led to the violent displacement of native peoples. The French, on the other hand, centered their colonial efforts around the highly lucrative fur trade. Because they relied on trapping and navigating these huge, vast terrains, their system necessitated extensive networks and strategic interdependent alliances with indigenous nations, alongside Catholic Jesuit missionary work. These two fundamentally incompatible systems weren't just coexisting, they were on a collision course. It was only a matter of time before the pressure cracked and sparked a global war.
Moving on to Section 4, Indigenous Resistance and Adaptation.
Now, what's really interesting about this era is that indigenous nations were absolutely not passive victims in this scramble for empires. They navigated these competing powers with a highly sophisticated mix of strategies. You had outright military resistance, like the highly successful Pueblo Revolt of 1680 against the Spanish. You had powerful strategic alliances, like the Huron-Wendat nation allying with the French to mutually control the fur trade and defend their respective territories. And you had incredible adaptation, too, with indigenous peoples actively acquiring and adopting European firearms and metal tools, which entirely altered the economic and military dynamics of the continent to suit their own survival and geopolitical goals. Which leads us directly to our fifth and final era, sparks of the Revolution. So eventually, that building tension between the British and French exploded into the 7 Years' War, a massive global conflict. While Great Britain ultimately won and secured dominance in North America, they were left with staggering, massive military debts. And to pay those debts, London decided it was time to squeeze its American colonies for money. But you have to understand the context of what life was like for the colonists before this. For decades, the colonies had lived under an unofficial policy called salutary neglect. Because of the vast ocean separating them from London, the British mostly let the colonies manage their own affairs and largely ignored strict trade enforcement. It was a kind of informal freedom. So when Britain suddenly ended this policy to forcibly collect taxes for a war they fought an ocean away, the colonists didn't just feel financially burdened. No, they felt profoundly betrayed. Let's move along and see how this builds because it spirals into a chain reaction incredibly quickly. Step 1. You have the Navigation Acts heavily restricting colonial trade so that it benefits only England. Step 2. Britain incurs that massive war debt. Step 3. Parliament tries to offset that debt by imposing direct internal taxes, like the Stamp Act, without giving the colonist any representation in government. This taxation without representation causes absolute outrage. And finally, step 4, the tension boils over into the streets with the deadly Boston Massacre in 1770, where British soldiers fired into a crowd of angry colonists. Blood had been spilled, and there was absolutely no turning back. The fracture between empire and colony became completely permanent on a cold night in December 1773. In a desperate, catalytic response to the Tea Act, which basically gave a British monopoly the right to undercut local American merchants, citizens of Boston boarded 3 ships and destroyed over 92,000 pounds of East India Company tea, dumping the whole shebang right into the harbor. The Boston Tea Party proved that the colonists were willing to take extreme, destructive action to defend their economic and political autonomy. It was a massive point of no return. So the crucial point is, as John Adams would later realize, this wasn't just about money or trade routes anymore. It was a fundamental ideological shift. The colonists had evolved from being loyal British subjects simply asking for fair treatment into completely new political actors who felt a deep resentment of injury. They realized their natural rights were being fundamentally violated, and that realization was the literal spark that ignited the fight for a completely new nation. We've seen how a single voyage in the 1400s set off an unstoppable 300-year chain reaction, a cascade that collapsed ancient empires, dropped global temperatures and changed the climate, sparked world wars between massive European powers, and eventually gave birth to an entirely new kind of revolution. It leaves us with a profound thought to end this explainer. If one era of discovery could literally rewrite the Earth's climate and birth new nations over the span of centuries, what invisible domino effects are quietly shaping our world today? Keep looking for those hidden connections, and I'll see you next time.